Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 5th webinar in the Teacher Effectiveness Series. Today's webinar is on the Common Core State Standards in Teacher Effectiveness, being hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory of the Mid-Atlantic. My name is Elizabeth Greniger. I'm the facilitator for this webinar series, and I have the pleasure of joining with us today Ross Weiner from the Aspen Institute. So our agenda for today, we've just welcomed you to the webinar, and next you'll hear a little bit about the REL Mid-Atlantic from our director, Teresa Duncan, via video. Then I'll be introducing the presenter, and he'll spend about an hour, a little over an hour, presenting some valuable information about the Common Core State Standards and Teacher Effectiveness. And once his presentation concludes, we'll open up for questions, and he'll be able to respond to the questions you have. We are trying to wrap the webinar up by 5 o'clock Eastern Time, so we'll go for about 2 hours. And again, to guide you through the webinar session, the agenda will be posted on the left-hand side of the screen at all times. At this time, we'll be showing a brief video with Teresa Duncan from the REL Mid-Atlantic.
Welcome to today's REL Mid-Atlantic webinar. REL Mid-Atlantic serves Delaware, the District of Columbia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. As you probably know, the Regional Educational Laboratories, or RELs, are part of the Institute of Education Sciences, the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Our primary mission is to form research alliances with educators and policymakers to help states and school districts use research results to answer important questions about education policy and practice. Our services include direct research and technical assistance products and services. This webinar falls into the category of technical assistance, which includes bridge events, trainings, workshops, how-to guides, and white papers. Through webinars like this one, we hope to reach educators who are interested in but are unable to attend our live bridge events. Our goal for the webinar series is to provide an online space for conversation where you can work with experts and with your colleagues on the education challenges that you care about. At the end of each session, we'll ask you to rate us by completing a brief survey. Your input is important and will help us to better serve your needs. We hope that you'll find this webinar informative and engaging. And now, let's get started.
The specific purpose of our Teacher Effectiveness webinar series is to provide stakeholders in the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond with opportunities to discuss many topics within the field of teacher effectiveness. One of the goals of the series is to increase participants' understanding and use of research-based teacher effectiveness strategies. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to find out who's joining us today. You'll see a poll come up on your screen, and we'd like you to select the option that best fits the role that you serve in your state or district. So it looks like we have a pretty diverse audience today. We have several LEA folks and several researchers and other stakeholders joining us. And I'm sure everyone has some base knowledge of Common Core state standards at this point, but we hope that you'll be all taking something back to your role and be able to serve your constituents in a positive way. At this time, I'm going to introduce our presenter. Ross Weiner is currently the Vice President and Executive Director of the Education and Society Program at the Aspen Institute. In this role, Ross leads professional learning networks for urban school district leaders and senior congressional education staffers. The program assists policymakers and education leaders in strengthening human capital systems, supporting implementation of Common Core state standards, and strategically reallocating financial resources. In the past, Mr. Weiner has served in a variety of educational policy leadership roles. From 2002 to 2009, he served as the Policy Director and then Vice President for Program and Policy at the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to raising standards and closing achievement gaps in public education. Mr. Weiner managed EdTrust's research and data analysis, policy development, conference programming, and technical assistance to educators and policymakers in both K-12 and higher ed. And prior to working for EdTrust, Mr. Weiner served for 5 years as a trial attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Educational Opportunities Section, where he represented the United States in cases dealing with desegregation, harassment, and the adequacy of services to limited English proficient and disabled students. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Ross Weiner.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited for our conversation this afternoon. So want to thank the organizers for creating this opportunity and allowing a focus on this set of issues. And want to thank all of you for making the time and being on. And just want to acknowledge, I'm actually not able to see the slides right now. So I'm going to be asking the organizers to advance the slides. And if you could go to the slide on the background on Aspen Institute's education work. So just very briefly, a little context about where the learning that I'm going to try to talk to them about this afternoon has come from in our work at the Aspen Institute. So we run several professional learning networks in education and education policy. One is a network of 15 urban school districts, and we design retreats and workshops for the superintendents, the chief academic officers, the chief financial officers, and the literacy and math teams. And we partner with the Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin to support the Math Leadership Network. We also direct a network of senior congressional staffers whose full-time job is working on education policy on the Education Committee. So this is bipartisan and bicameral. It has folks from both the House and the Senate. And then we do lots of work in between those network retreats, just sort of an ad hoc, helping to convene conversations, profiling what we think of as especially promising work, and making policy recommendations. And I'll talk about recent policy recommendations in just a minute. We focus on strengthening human capital systems and on building a capacity to deliver on the promise of the Common Core state standards, and so that really leads to the recommendations for today. So if you could advance to slide 12. As the title suggests, we're going to be focused on the Common Core and how the Common Core state standards impacts and can be integrated with work to improve teacher effectiveness. So quickly, you can see on your screen, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what are the Common Core state standards and why are they important, how are the Common Core being implemented currently, and then really dig into how do we align teacher evaluation systems with the objectives and the standards embedded in the Common Core, and how do we align curriculum and professional development with the Common Core. So if you could advance to slide 13, what are the Common Core state standards? So this is a state-led effort launched by governors and state commissioners of education. It was initially launched by leaders in 48 states, 2 territories, and DC. the standards were developed through a very collaborative process. Lots of different stakeholders, including educators, as well as researchers and policymakers, engaged in setting these. And then it took from the best of current state standards. It looked at standards used in higher performing countries and developed these Common Core state standards, which are designed to be both robust and relevant to the real world, reflecting the knowledge and skills that students are going to need both when they get out and go to post-secondary education and to careers. So if you would advance to slide number 14, just a little bit about how the Common Core was developed. And I'll say for these next two slides, I'm really conveying information from other sources, but this is certainly a process that I've been very familiar with. But, you know, talking about how the CCSSO and the National Governors Association came to this, they brought together educators across K-12 as well as educators from higher ed. They looked at standards from lots of states, from lots of other systems. They had multiple rounds of feedback. And they chose English language arts and math as the first subjects to choose from, although they also built out, and I think this is very important and will come up again when we talk about the teacher effectiveness work, they articulated very specific literacy expectations that need to be embedded in the instruction of content area disciplines in secondary subjects. So for science and social studies and technical subjects like CTE courses, they actually articulated literacy standards that need to be both taught and then assessed in those subjects. And want to acknowledge that both CCSSO and the National Governors Association acknowledge that other subjects are absolutely critical, but CCSSO and NGA are not developing content standards in other subjects right now. They're really focusing on implementing the Common Core in ELA and mathematics and the literacy expectations in these other subjects. So you advance to slide 15. The Common Core has been adopted by 45 states, by Washington, D.C., by 4 territories, and by the Department of Defense, schools that are run for military families. If you could advance to slide 16. So, you know, this next slide is about why the Common Core is important. And obviously, standards themselves are a foundational piece of setting clear expectations about what we want all students to know, no matter where they live, no matter where they're growing up. And I think one of the important attributes of the Common Core is that it really is explicit about ensuring that all students are prepared for the expectations in post-secondary education and in the workforce. And it really, this can be a great driver of equity, both within states, because I think the Common Core really articulates an excellent set of expectations for students, also across states, because standards were so different. And we do have a highly mobile society, and it doesn't make sense when we think about the expectations that students are going to face to really be so dramatically different in those expectations when they're in their K-12 education. So standards, again, they're this foundational element that helps teachers figure out the knowledge and skills their students should have so that educators, classroom teachers, building leaders, curriculum and instruction staff can build the lessons and the environments that students need. Standards also help students and parents really understand what are the goals and what does success look like. Basically, they provide this sort of infrastructure, this roadmap for what we're hoping is happening in schools. So if you advance to slide 17. So Common Core implementation. Common Core aligned assessments are going to be implemented for the first time in the 2014-15 school year, and in many states those tests are being field tested this year. That means this school year, though, is a really huge opportunity to ensure that teachers and students are fully prepared. At the same time, many states are developing evaluation systems that hold teachers accountable for students' mastery and students' mastery of the standards, and those standards now are the Common Core. And that in many states, they are having conversations about how colleges can use scores on Common Core aligned assessments, both to make the remediation and basically placement decisions. Also want to acknowledge just a transition in where the information is coming from. For these next few slides, I'm going to be talking about the data that came out from a Center on Education Policy report that surveyed state leaders and got their impressions on what was happening in the field. So if you'd advance to slide 18, in early 2013, CEP, the Center on Education Policy at George Washington University, conducted this comprehensive survey, and 40 states responded, including 39 states that had adopted the Common Core in both math and English language arts, and one that had adopted the standards in English language arts only. And so now the Center on Education Policy is publishing a series of reports based on the findings from these surveys, and it gives you just an overview of state efforts so far. And what you see from this slide, 23 states surveyed report that a Common Core aligned curricula is currently in place for some grades and content areas, but that many states are struggling to provide adequate resources and staffing to implement the standards effectively. If you'd advance to slide 19. So again, drawing from the Center on Education Policy report, all states agreed that the Common Core were more rigorous than previous standards and that they will improve students' skill in these subjects. 75% had implemented the aligned curriculum in at least some districts or some grade levels, and that states are facing lots of challenges, including developing evaluation systems that hold educators accountable for student mastery of the Common Core. So slide 20, and why don't I turn this back to the host team to help you go through the next survey question.
Great. Thanks, Ross, for that overview of the Common Core and the history of how we got to where we are right now. What we'd like for the audience to do right now is to consider this question that's listed on the screen. What are some of the biggest challenges facing teachers today with relation to transitioning to the Common Core state standards? You'll see a poll pop up onto the screen, and we'd like to hear your responses to that question. So I'm seeing a lot of comments about aligning resources and curriculum, ensuring professional development is provided that's high quality. Time for implementation. I'm sure many of these comments are resonating with the audience that, there's more than one challenge. I think people are facing multiple challenges simultaneously. Leadership at the school and district level, we'll be getting to talk a little bit about that through our presentation today. A big emphasis on professional development and how we can structure that to best support teachers and administrators. We know that the rigor of the Common Core is often at a level that's higher than what many states had in their prior standards, and making that jump for both teachers and students has been a challenge. Meeting the needs of students with disabilities, our English language learners. I see some comments about technology and changing the evaluation systems. We'll talk a little bit about how we're evaluating teachers and how that plays into this conversation. several comments I've seen regarding administrators and their involvement in this professional learning associated with Common Core. I see the comment about teachers being confused and concerned, and the public as well. I think that that is definitely an issue that's reverberating throughout the country. People are concerned, but some places are embracing this as a challenge that we're willing to undertake and looking at the long-term outcomes. At this point, Ross, do you have any comments about some of the responses you've seen?
Yeah, so I saw, there are a couple of comments about the need to unpack the standards for their daily use, making sure that we're focusing on building capacity in the field to really implement the standards, and then, this tension that I think we'll really get into about doing evaluation at the same time potentially can take people's eye off the goal of implementing Common Core. And I think that speaks right to the heart of why I've focused on this set of recommendations around how can we make this more integrated for teachers and principals so they see the work they're doing in evaluation as critical to advancing Common Core and not a separate thing that they also have to do. So I thought those were some great comments. There was another comment about making sure administrators participate in the training, which does seem critical, again, especially with so much going on, helping those administrators to see all of this as a holistic way of improving instruction rather than a set of initiatives to implement. And last thing I wanted to comment on was, somebody commented on the need to ensure foundational skills. And I think that's absolutely right. I think we have to acknowledge there's lots of content knowledge that we have to do with teachers around the Common Core itself, its rationale, the research base, and then how do you do that in instruction and not just, try and, in a sense, teacher-proof the Common Core implementation or give so much scaffolding in a sense that we're never asking people to dig into the content and really deeply understand it. So I think all of those issues resonated with me, and they will come back up, I think, as we go through the presentation. All right, so getting back into the presentation then, just a little bit more information from that Center on Education Policy report. So most states report that they are taking specific actions to prepare teachers to teach the Common Core. So there's professional development materials, there are guides aligned, they're carrying out statewide professional development initiatives, briefing university faculty in schools of education. I will say, just as an aside on that, I think we really need to start thinking about higher education faculty more generally, both because of those literacy implications in the content areas that are going to be taught largely by arts and sciences faculty, and to start to have a pretty different conversation about placement and remediation, but that's a whole other set of issues. And then encouraging school and district PLCs on Common Core implementation. So lots of different ways states are reporting coming at this. So teacher evaluation and the Common Core. So as we've started to acknowledge in this conversation, at the same time that most states are transitioning to the Common Core, most states are also developing teacher evaluation systems, and significantly for the first time, many of those systems are including measurement of student performance as a significant metric within the evaluation system. So this is, there's lots of different reasons for this, but I think a couple of important catalysts are the Race to the Top competition and then the ESEA flexibility waiver process. But the bottom line is, at the same time we're trying to get much more sophisticated about how we measure teacher effectiveness, we are trying to make sure that we are implementing a set of more rigorous, more ambitious standards. So it creates, this huge opportunity because there's all this change is going to be going on for teacher effectiveness systems one way or another. And so I hope we can see this as an opportunity to integrate and embed these more ambitious standards that we are hoping students and teachers will begin to experience. So, part one, challenges facing districts and states. Well, a first challenge is aligning teacher evaluation and the measurement of student learning with the Common Core state standards. So, and that takes a couple of different forms. One is that the Common Core has implications for the teaching that we want to see in classrooms. So, when we talk about wanting to make sure that marshaling evidence from text, that students are able to closely and independently read complex text and then to construct logical arguments based on that text and to critique the arguments that are made by others by using evidence, by weighing the relevance and the credibility of evidence. In the math standards, so those come from the literacy standards. In the math standards, those they actually talk about constructing logical arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. The Common Core articulates explicit speaking and listening standards. So these are things that have implications for teaching, and as we get more focused on observing teacher practice, we need to make sure that we are asking the right questions so that we're asking whether the instruction that we're observing in classrooms is advancing the Common Core expectations. We also, as we try and create measures of student learning that can help us determine whether, teachers' contributions to that learning, we need to make sure that where the Common Core standards apply, we are using measures that that assess whether the Common Core, whether students are mastering the Common Core and to what extent. And both of these present, both of these ways, by both observing the teaching itself and measuring student learning, again, present challenges and opportunities in making sure that the Common Core is advanced through this work. So now I know that there is another poll, and we want to hear from the participants again, so let me turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Great, thanks, Ross. So you see the question on the screen. We're interested at this point in finding out from you all what's happening in your states, districts, or schools to align teacher evaluation with the Common Core. And you'll see several multiple choice options, and you can select one or more than one as it applies to the work that's happening in your context. It looks like, by and large, many folks are focusing on A, which is to include student performance on the aligned assessments, being the ones that Park and SBAC are developing to align with the Common Core. Those are definitely being considered as part of the teacher evaluation system. But it looks like C and D are, coming in there closely following, evaluating instruction as it aligns to college and career readiness, taking into consideration some of the key instructional shifts and looking at how those are incorporated into the teacher evaluation framework, and then offering professional development that connects the skills specified by Common Core within the teacher evaluation system. It doesn't look like many people at all are focusing on just not doing a teacher evaluation system. So it goes back to the point of what Ross was saying, is that everyone is going to be evaluating teachers in some way, and there's going to be alignment to the Common Core in some way. So being more informed about this topic is really going to help people understand the connectedness and ensure that at all levels folks are prepared for this shift. Ross, did you want to mention anything else about the poll, the responses that you saw?
Yeah, so I'll say, 42% of you so far of those who have replied have indicated that the system you're working in is offering professional development that makes explicit the connections between the skills specified by the Common Core and the teacher evaluation systems, and I think that's very encouraging. And obviously, I hope that number will grow, but even 42%, I think we've seen in a number of places that because these were established as separate initiatives in some ways, that there tended to be professional development that dealt with, here's how the teacher evaluation system is going to work, and didn't make explicit connections with the Common Core standards, and other professional development that was about the content of the Common Core and the implications for instruction, but didn't make explicit the connections with the teacher evaluation system and how those measures were going to be used. So I think it's great that 42% are saying that that's something that's already going on, and hopefully when we check back in, down the road, that can be up, towards the 75, 80, 95% that we were seeing around including the large assessment consortia scores. So hopefully we will turn back to some of those. Oh, sorry. Still on the poll. All right. So I think now we're going to get into some of the recommendations that I articulated in this report, Teaching to the Core. And, let me say, so this was published earlier this year by the Aspen Institute and CCSSO. And it really did come out of some both direct work with systems and seeing how this work both had great synergy within it, but that oftentimes it was actually playing out in a sort of siloed way. And also recognizing, actually, I was one of the initial peer reviewers on ESEA Review, and one of my takeaways was that the flexibility request actually asked about these things largely in separate buckets. It asked states what they were doing around building a teacher effectiveness system. It asked states to articulate what they were doing around college and career ready standards, but it didn't really ask systems to tie that together, and it just seemed like an unattended set of issues and a real opportunity to strengthen the work. So develop these 10 recommendations, and we're going to dive into just a few of them today, but obviously if you are curious, I would encourage any of you to go ahead and look at all 10 recommendations, and this is available. There's a link in this presentation, and it's available on the Aspen Institute website. So let me dive in, and recommendation number 1 is really about enabling and encouraging the prioritization of Common Core instructional shifts in teacher evaluations. And I'll say we're diving in because of our limited time today. I think one of the first steps that I recommend in the paper is really to actually just put the teams that are working on these areas together, put the timelines and the project plans and deliverables next to each other, and really just have a conversation about where are the opportunities to bring this together. But then as you get more into the recommendations, it starts to get more into the guts of the work, and that's really where we're going to spend our time together today. So when I talk about enabling and encouraging the prioritization of Common Core instructional shifts in teacher evaluation, I'm actually really talking about, we're making this huge investment in observations and that kind of observation and feedback cycle between teachers and principals, or teachers and other observers of their instruction, other evaluators, other coaches, and that that's a really important development in the work, because we're getting really serious about people having shared understanding about instruction. And the opportunity that creates is that if we make sure that the most important work that we want to see under the Common Core is embedded in those teaching frameworks, then we're much more likely to have conversations that help people see how these things come together. And one particular recommendation in this regard is to consider focusing some observations really particularly on the instructional shifts. And so we'll come back around to that a little bit later, but it's really about being clear about what are some priorities that the Common Core is asking to be implemented that could also then be prioritized in the way we are advancing the teacher evaluation system. And then, so the next slide is really drawing from some work that was done at Achieve and at another organization, Education First, that's really been central to supporting Race to the Top states. And they picked out some important attributes of aligning teacher evaluation systems to the Common Core. So statewide assessments and student learning objectives and other classroom assessment tools focus on the instructional shifts in the Common Core. Teacher observation rubrics and model teaching standards clearly articulate the knowledge and skills that teachers need to become proficient to deliver instructional lines to the core. Teacher evaluation reports and results are framed that use the same language as the Common Core. I think one of the things that we tend to do is sometimes we can be talking about really the same content, but if we have slightly different vocabularies, I think people don't realize how those connections can be made. And then lastly is really making sure that we're seizing those opportunities around professional development to understand where do teachers need to build their content knowledge and their skills around Common Core, and how do we purpose the professional development activities that we are doing to strengthen that work. And so this is a moment to say these are actually some rubrics of looking at whether teachers are teaching complex in their classes and using text-dependent questions that we actually developed. We networked the literacy directors from several of our partner urban school districts, and then we brought in consultants from Student Achievement Partners and some of the folks who worked on writing the English language arts and literacy standards. And we developed a set of professional learning modules. And again, all of those are up online on our website. And so if you go to there's a link to our digital resource library in the resource box, and it will take you to this PD module. Let me just spend 1 minute on this. So we started by having a conversation with the literacy directors about what do the teachers need to know in order to instruct, to get students to meet these standards. And we started unpacking the literacy standards, and we recognized that teachers haven't had a lot of instruction or practice or experience selecting complex text, like using the quantitative and qualitative metrics that the Common Core speaks of in terms of making sure that text is appropriately complex. They also haven't had as much practice or instruction, many of them, in crafting text-dependent questions and in sponsoring dialogue and conversation among students to really get deeper into the texts that they are trying to instruct on. And so we have built out these professional development modules. They are available online for free. They have the presentations. They have the kinds of activities that teachers themselves can engage in. And I think we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about what we're learning about what teachers need in order to deepen their knowledge and their facility with using the standards to improve instruction. But here's both a self-assessment tool and then an observation tool that you could use to ask, okay, is classroom instruction focusing on the instructional shift? So by the way, there's now a fourth module. There are 3 modules available around the close reading standards and using text-dependent questions. And we thought we were actually going to do one additional model on the writing standards, the different genres of academic writing and how they're expected to be implemented through the Common Core. We actually, once we started working with the literacy directors, we realized actually that teachers need much more base building and foundational content knowledge around the writing expectations of the Common Core. So we've broken that into 3 modules. The first one is out, which is really just about learning what are the 3 genres of academic writing under the Common Core and how can they be embedded in a curriculum. So also wanted to point out there's lots and lots of work being developed right now. So this is showing you a screen capture from the Insight Core framework. Insight Education Group helped to build out the teaching frameworks that are used in Washington, D.C., and in Memphis, Tennessee, and in Syracuse, New York. And they actually built a new framework that was really, it uses the language and the logic of the Common Core to really try to focus on observing classroom instruction in ways that promotes mastery of Common Core. So, and it helps observers to focus on the instructional practices that will really advance the Common Core expectations. So that's another free online resource if folks want to take a look at that. I think we're going to come back to the Danielson framework has also been updated. So let me transition to recommendation number 2, which is to more specifically require that definitions of high-quality teaching practice used in Common Core, used in teacher evaluations are aligned with the Common Core. So again, we're making a massive investment in observations right now, really in many, many systems across the country. And I think the early results are that, you know, against what we've seen in research settings, the observation ratings that we're seeing coming from the field are very much inflated. That is, that teachers are getting very high scores against observation rubric, and yet, so the MET study, the Measures of Effective Teaching study from the Gates Foundation, one of the things they did was they videoed thousands and thousands of hours of teachers teaching, and then Charlotte Danielson and other framework writers, both, they were personally engaged in training trainers to observe and score those videos. And when they did that, they found that there were a lot of teachers struggled with the observation ratings. So let me quickly, I'm gonna skip to the next slide and say a little more about that and then come back to the previous slide briefly. But so this is just showing the distribution of scores that the raters got against the framework for teaching, the Danielson framework that is by far the most commonly used framework for observing teaching in this country right now. And what they saw is that actually many teachers were proficient at managing student behavior, creating an environment of respect and rapport, but that most teachers struggled with skills like using and questioning and discussion techniques and using assessments in instruction. I would say using questioning and discussion techniques in particular is a place where that is a critical set of skills for advancing the Common Core, and it is one where most teachers struggle. So this creates a huge opportunity for focusing on the way we're looking at teacher effectiveness in ways that really can advance the Common Core. So I want to talk just for a minute about the Danielson framework in Common Core. So again, I said the framework is by far the most commonly used framework right now. It's got 4 domains: planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. And I would say certainly for those first 3, planning and preparation, classroom environment, and instruction, really there's very clear implications from the Common Core, especially in domain 1, around knowing the standards so you can plan and being able to use assessment data to prepare for future lessons. And also, obviously, in instruction is what we have been talking about. So Charlotte Danielson and her team actually updated the frameworks in 2013 to reflect an increased alignment with the Common Core state standards, specifically emphasizing that close reading of text, emphasizing the increasing use and discussion around nonfiction literature in English language arts, and a growing fluency and skill in the application of math concepts. So these changes require deeper conceptual understanding of content by teachers to bring the Common Core to life. And I think many of these things were sort of generally already present in the framework, but it has been, some of the language has been tightened and strengthened to more clearly articulate this deep conceptual understanding, this focus on the precise use of language, the importance of students being intellectually engaged, not just well-behaved, and again, this precise use of academic language. So it's one of the things that's important to realize is they had done a more comprehensive update in either 2011 or 2012, and that many places are still using that framework. So it's important to check whether the system that you're in is using the updated framework and to recognize those fairly discrete changes but important ones for supporting this shift to the Common Core. Also just wanted to highlight the Newark, New Jersey teacher evaluation framework. They really, they decided in Newark to build a completely new framework, in part because they didn't think that any of the existing frameworks were tightly enough aligned with and reflected Common Core's expectations. So, and they tried to use the same standards that the Common Core standards writers articulated in the beginning. They wanted a teaching framework to be fewer, that is not to be so overwhelming that you couldn't really use it in any classroom observation, use the whole thing. They wanted it to be clearer, so prioritizing clear and concise language that really creates that shared understanding between the teacher and the observer, and higher. They wanted to increase the expectations so that they reflected college and career readiness. And so on this next slide, on 35, you just see some of the ways in which they have made those changes. So the instructional shifts are very clearly and explicitly articulated. They really articulate expectations around teaching students for mastery, not just coverage. They're clear about elements that, so they did something interesting with the framework in Newark. There are, in these large domains, they have broken it up into things that you should be able to observe when you walk into any classroom on any day, and things that you might not see on any given day, but that ought to be present over the course of the year. So acknowledging that not every lesson is going to meet all of what we want to see in teaching. And they tried to be very explicit about observable behavior. And last, in this section about this integration of Common Core into the way we're doing observations. So we talked about before that teachers struggle with using questioning and discussion techniques. So want to be clear, actually, that wasn't just in MET. Actually, recent data from Chicago showed that this was the skill teachers struggled most with in Chicago, and same in Hillsborough County, Florida, which is Tampa. So this is subdomain 3B in the Danielson framework, and I think one of the things that Hillsborough did that was so smart is, so teachers started getting scores back from their observation ratings, and the most common message that teachers were getting in terms of areas they needed to work on was on discussion and questioning techniques. Now, Hillsborough County administrators recognized that questioning and discussion techniques was absolutely vital to advancing Common Core. So instead of trying to address teachers' needs in 3B with one set of activities and advance the Common Core with another set of activities, they embedded what they wanted teachers to learn about the Common Core's focus on discussioning and questioning techniques into professional development that was explicitly marketed, was explicitly communicated to teachers as responding to their need to strengthen skills in 3B on Danielson. So teachers experienced the professional development as addressing a need that had been identified for them, not as something else that they had to do moving forward. And it seems like that's a great example of how we can start to integrate this work and not ask teachers and principals to have to do that kind of integration work on their own, but actually take it on a system level. And you'll see there's a link there if anybody's interested. We did a profile of the build out and design and early implementation of that system in Hillsborough County, Florida. And so you can get that on our website as well. So recommendation number 3 is about insisting that the assessments used in the evaluation of teachers measure the Common Core. And, you know, I made this case in the paper that if we simultaneously make student learning data matter much more, but we fail to make sure that it measures the Common Core, then I just feel like we are creating this untenable dilemma for teachers where There's something that they should do for their evaluations this year, and there's something they should do for their students and for strengthening instruction in the long term and moving forward, and that we have got to resolve that tension at a policy level. But that really breaks out into two things, and one I think is a little bit out of our hands for what we can deal with on this phone call, and I think what many of you have in your responsibilities, and that's the statewide summative tests. I mean, the CCSSO has made some recommendations around this transition time to the new Common Core aligned tests. The department has indicated some preliminary flexibility that they're open to, but I think that continues to be an ongoing conversation, both about what states want to do and about what the department will find appropriate under the waiver system. But I want us to spend our time today talking about another aspect that's more in the control of local educators. So most states, there are additional measures that are needed beyond state sort of value-added scores or growth percentiles, and those come in two ways. One, even for teachers like in grades 4 through 8, where you might have state-level value-added scores, most states require an additional measure of student learning for those teachers. So, it might be where if student learning gains count for 40% of evaluation, 20% is coming from the state test, 20% is coming from additional measures. And those additional measures are usually being developed at the local level. So there's an opportunity for measuring Common Core mastery. And the other area is in social studies, science, and technical subjects and secondary grades, is making sure that we're measuring the literacy standards in the assessments of student learning for understanding the effectiveness of teachers in those subjects. Because if we stick with multiple choice, just content-driven tests, can you answer all of these multiple choice questions about biology, and we don't ask students to write up a lab report, I think we're really missing an opportunity. And I think teachers will get the message that they don't have to do those literacy standards, that that's, in a sense, somebody else's work to do. So let's spend a couple of more minutes on this topic. I think it's important to recognize current tests have weak alignment to Common Core expectations. So one of the things they did in the Measuring Effective Teacher study at the Gates Foundation was they used the state tests and they used a complementary measure. And they found that, and the complementary measure they used was an open-ended test that asked students to read somewhat longer passages and then to write to show their comprehension, to show they understood it. And I think what they found was that achievement gains based on this alternate measure that required more writing, they were both more reliable, that is, they had less, they fluctuated less for teachers, but they were also more closely related than the current tests with classroom observations and with student surveys. And so Tom Kane, the principal architect of that Measures of Effective Teaching study, wrote that states should hasten efforts to add writing prompts to literacy assessments. And so, this seems like an area where adding writing prompts is something that local leaders really have an opportunity to do. And that's not a small or easy thing, but it seems like a critical place to make the connection between how we're measuring student learning for teacher effectiveness and whether we're measuring Common Core expectations. So switching now, part 2, challenges facing districts and states. One of the big challenges, and this came up in the comments earlier, is about aligning curriculum and professional development to the Common Core. And I think what we're focused on, in particular in this conversation, is the opportunity to ensure that professional development brings teachers to the level of understanding that they need to implement the Common Core. So with that, let me turn it back over to Elizabeth, because I think it's another opportunity for us to hear from you about what's going on.
Sure, great. Yeah, at this point we'd like to hear a little bit more about what type of alignment you're doing in your context to align curriculum and PD with the Common Core. So we'll be putting up another poll, and please share your responses with us. And Ross, maybe while people are gathering their thoughts on this question, something that came through in our questions about content on the left-hand side was related to teacher preparation. And could you speak a little bit about what you know about what's happening with higher ed teacher preparation programs and how they're adjusting to meet the demands that teachers are facing once they enter K-12?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I did some diving into this recently and worked with teacher educators in Massachusetts a couple of weeks ago. I will say, I think that there is a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done in teacher preparation, and I would start actually by making sure that professors and instructors in schools of education are themselves studying the standards. These are the foundational documents for what teachers are going to be expected to do moving forward. And then I think it's about unpacking those standards, and I know we had one of the participants talked about that they're already doing that in their education school, and that's great. I think, I will tell you, I put together a focus group of 8 ed school deans sometime early in the year. Actually, it was late last year. It was almost a year ago now, and very little by then had been done. There were 2 of them who were in states who had won Race to the Top, and they talked about Race to the Top having provided resources to do that, so they were doing it. I think the other 6, really, it hadn't been much of an issue on their faculties yet. So creating time and the expectation that ed school faculty will study these standards, and then really unpacking the standards to understand where the teachers need the most content building. Because I do think in sponsoring these kinds of discussions and debates where students are expected to make logical arguments, to critique logical arguments of others, to really stick with the text as the source of evidence, to select complex text. These are places that teachers are going to need much more support and instruction and practice than they've had in the past. The other things we talked about is in mathematics, you know, it's really the Common Core has cleared away lots of content from different years so that teachers can really focus. But that focus to go deeper on comprehension and mastery, I think especially for many elementary school teachers, it is going to test the depth of their math comprehension. I think ed schools need to really think about what are the new expectations mean around mathematics, and recognizing that, you know, teachers are going to be coming out into a world where the Common Core is very present from day one. So just baking that into the kinds of discussions they're having, the kinds of clinical experiences they're having, it seems like there's tons to do there. So I guess those are my recommendations there, and I don't know, you've maybe had a chance to follow the comments coming in a little bit more. And,
yeah, I'm seeing a theme here related to curriculum development, and you know, in my work with districts and states also, I see this happening across the country. This, you know, a lot of people are trying to own their curriculum locally, which is one thing that the Common Core advocates for, that should be local ownership. And then I see some people are revising their prior curriculum. Some people may not be developing curriculum. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the realm of experiences that states and districts are having?
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's a really interesting tension that we just have to be cognizant of and thoughtful about between, so obviously we want ownership of the standards at the local level, at the individual teacher level, but in schools and communities, people need to own these. They need to see them as their standards, not as doing something for somebody else. On the other hand, we don't want to recreate the wheel 3 million times over in this country, and one of the benefits of having the Common Core is that it does create actually consistency across virtually the entire country. Teachers in second grade and third grade and fourth grade are going to be holding their students to the same expectations. And so the ability to adapt model lessons, model curricular units, strategies from other places has grown immensely. And so how do we take advantage of all of those resources in a way that builds ownership? And I think that's, something that folks are going to have to figure out in their own context. I would say it strikes me that one of the challenges is that everybody will, in a sense, create their own definition of what good enough looks like to meet the Common Core, and that will really undermine the value of having these consistent standards. So figuring out a way where folks can work across schools and across districts and even across states to sort of look out for the integrity of the standards, to make sure that the rigor is there, the quality, the depth. And so setting up sort of online communities that can comment with each other, that can jury each other's work. And some of those are happening now. Share My Lesson, BetterLesson.com, LearnZillion. There are lots of places now where teachers can upload their work and also then see how did other people use it and what are their comments. So I think it's really about getting that balance right. And I would say one of the things that I worry about, because we're trying to do so much so fast, is that we don't feel like there's time to engage teachers deeply in really learning the standards, not the synopsis of the standards, but the standards, and creating that space for them to work with their colleagues around really understanding the implications for instruction and for the kind of assignments we give students, the kind of work we have them engaged in all the time. And I think we cannot shortchange that. So figuring out where that time comes from, I think, is a huge leadership challenge in this work.
Yeah, I agree, Ross. That's come through in a lot of the webinars we've had, is this making this time for professional educators to collaborate and to engage around multiple topics, but primarily being the instructional piece and ensuring that there is the time and the resources made available to let them do the work that we're asking them to do.
Yeah, so, and I see there's a strand in the conversation about CTE, and I think each of those disciplines presents its own set of challenges in terms of science and social studies as well. I really want to echo the last comment that came up around, if you have teacher buy-in, if teachers embrace this as their work, then you can work through the issues. If it feels like they are doing somebody else's work, and it's a distraction from their content, then this isn't going to work. And so I think the challenge is, look, I think what the Common Core is clear about, and I think this is true, is that if you are going to work in a technical field, the demands of today's workplace, you are going to need high-level communication skills. You are going to need to read you're going to need to read complex text within your domain, and you are going to need to write about that and speak about that and communicate in a sophisticated way. So figuring out what does authentic work in the topic look like? What does authentic work in the discipline look like? And then use the Common Core literacy standards to make sure that those are present and that those are measured. Because, I think that teachers won't buy in if the system is set up that says, we'd like for you to do this because it's going to help students, but it's not going to have anything to do with how we ask how effective you are. And so that's where I think where there's a real synergy, and if we lose it, we will miss a huge opportunity. When, teacher evaluation applies to teachers in career and technical education as well. So working with them to say, how is the assessment of your effectiveness going to measure whether students have those high-level communication skills that they need in your field, I think is both totally legitimate and important for students, and what will make it important for their teachers as well. And I don't want to be I don't want to be crass. I don't think that's the only thing that motivates teachers, but I don't think we can have this incoherence where we say it's important for students, but we don't make it important for their teachers.
Ross, I think it's Great time to transition. We're going to talk a lot more about some examples and some of the work that's happening both in the Mid-Atlantic and beyond with respect to professional development.
Great. All right, so let me move us then back into the presentation. And so an early lesson from efforts to integrate Common Core into teacher effectiveness around and the professional development is that most teachers and principals need to develop foundational knowledge regarding the rationale, the research base, and the practical implications of the Common Core. This is not a step we can shortchange. And it's interesting because the instructional shifts, and I think that's probably something that, when you first become familiar with the Common Core, I think many people interact with the instructional shifts. So this emphasis on informational text, on text-dependent questions in English language arts, the emphasis on coherence and focus and rigor in the math. And I think those are important tools to focus our implementation efforts, but those cannot be instead of having educators study the standards and learn the standards and own the standards for themselves. So one resource that I'll point to that's not in this presentation, PARCC. So I don't know how many of you are involved in PARCC, which is one of the two assessment consortia that was funded through Race to the Top to develop Common Core aligned tests. But these resources are available free online at the PARCC website. That's the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. And the PARCC website, they have what they call, I'm trying to remember, these sort of frameworks, these content frameworks that show, like if you're a fourth grade teacher, they show you how the standards are different and raised from what was expected in third grade and what students are going to be expected to do in fifth grade, so you can really situate your focus for that year on what you can expect students coming in with and what they need, what they're getting ready to do, so you can really have that broader vision. That's one resource that I think teachers can use, like in a professional learning community, to really dig into the standards, because those draw very explicitly from the language of the standards. So I'm going to share an early lesson from our efforts to work with systems on professional development. There's lots of, so there's these instructional shifts, there's lots of exemplars out there now, there's videos of teachers doing instruction, but we really have to understand, what do teachers need to know to be able to do this? And I talked some about this before in literacy. Many teachers haven't been trained on selecting complex text or designing text-dependent questions, or in the distinctions between these types of academic writing. In math, covering fewer topics each year and spending more time on them is going to push on the content knowledge of our elementary teachers in mathematics. And so figuring out how we can focus on those things is a really important priority. Moving on, I think one of the things that we've done as we've tried, so I mentioned before, we've networked a set of literacy directors from big urban districts who all have to get this work done. We networked them together so they could try and create professional development modules together, and then to learn from what worked and what didn't. And so we field tested these units in a number of systems. And I think one of the things that we're trying to be very explicit about, that we had just been implicit about before, is that teachers, the professional learning activities that teachers are engaged in around Common Core need to model the kind of teaching that we want them to enact in their classrooms. So teachers should be reading complex text. They should be themselves participating in intellectually rigorous academic discourse, where they are making arguments and they are critiquing the arguments and the claims that are made by others. They should be synthesizing information from multiple sources. And finally, something that's just so important for the Common Core working, they should be applying what they learn to addressing real-world problems, not just having an academic discussion, but actually, during their professional development, working on what do I need to do in my classroom, in my school, in our professional learning community to make this happen for our students. So I think we really have to shift the paradigm from teachers coming to professional development and learning like passively, where they watch a presentation, they listen to the experts, and shift that to a model where they are engaged in doing the work and in reflecting on what it's going to take to enact these standards back in their classrooms. And now I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth, who's going to talk some about what she's learned from other states and the work that they're doing.
Thanks, Ross. Actually, this set of lessons is not explicitly from work that we're doing here at EdCount, but it is some lessons learned overall from some of the work that's happening in states. And so we're going to focus specifically on three, one of which is one of our Mid-Atlantic states, so I'm sure people from New Jersey will hear some themes that are happening within that state. But let me talk a little bit first about Kentucky. And so as part of the early adopters, Kentucky was one of the states that first really viewed this as a comprehensive approach to providing instruction to their students. And so they looked at ways that they could build capacity at their administrative level first so that they could support the implementation of the Common Core on down to the teacher level. And so they created these content and instructional support leadership networks, which are cross-district teams of educators, administrators, district leaders, and higher ed. So these groups got together and developed their curriculum and then followed up with meetings to problem solve and consider how the instructional design was impacting the instruction in the classrooms and continuing that conversation as implementation was ongoing. And over the years that they've been doing this for several years now, this scaffolded approach to curriculum development has, for them, done a few things with their curriculum, highlighting the alignment of the expectations to the Common Core, and then looking at where the curriculum has given opportunities for teachers and leaders to craft learning experiences for their students that align well with the Common Core. And to accompany all of this work around curriculum, the Kentucky Department of Education also has a variety of online professional learning and self-paced modules that support the curriculum and its implementation across the state. In New Jersey, the focus has really been on providing professional development to prepare and support teachers and principals for full implementation of Common Core. And in collaboration with the Regional Achievement Center staff, the New Jersey Department of Education staff have trained educators throughout the state, and these Common Core aligned trainings have provided a lot of different skills and knowledge to the educators in the state, but some of the primary focus have been on scaffolding student learning objectives, an emphasis on formative assessments, and an emphasis on the protocols for reviewing formative assessment data to inform the classroom instruction. So this goes into a little more depth about how the state of New Jersey is focusing on the alternate assessment opportunities beyond the summative assessments that Park and SBAC are creating. And finally, in New Mexico, the emphasis has really been on aligning the district, regional, and statewide resources, including those from higher ed. So we're seeing a theme here that some of these leading states are really engaging their higher ed faculty in these conversations. And in New Mexico, they did this work to implement a really detailed PD plan, and they focused on several priority focus areas, which you can see listed there, but really hitting on some of the points that Ross has already made about taking a look at what are the characteristics of a literate individual, what are the shifts in the Common Core, the language arts standards that tell us what a student looks like if they are literate. And specific to math, making explicit connections between the mathematical practices and the content, and ensuring that teachers understand these new connections, these new ways of looking at the mathematical content, and the shifts in both of those content areas. In addition, New Mexico really established a strong process for vetting their professional development providers, ensuring quality and consistency across the providers and the supports that they would be providing through the state. And they also ask districts to designate teacher leaders and build up this cadre of trainers to develop teacher content and pedagogical knowledge in support of the Common Core. And along with that, to have these teacher leaders really engage in instruction and assessment initiatives, the online professional development and development of curriculum and exemplary lessons. So really building the capacity of teachers to lead this work. Ross, I'll actually pass it back to you for the next few slides so you can share this next recommendation, and then I'll jump into some of the other examples we have towards the end.
Okay, great. And so this was just saying that, I think this is a huge opportunity for networking because everybody is engaged in this work at the same time. So, and I just offer two different ways of thinking about networking. So one is by role, and I think that principal supervisors are and in some ways have not been thought of as strategically as they should be during this time of huge transition. We're also, so principals, obviously principals themselves are key to whatever is going to happen in schools. And we are also in many places trying to get principal evaluations up and running. And this is a huge lift for principal evaluators, for folks who supervise principals who previously, in many ways they were troubleshooters, they managed compliance activities, they helped to leverage resources from the central office, but really being this coach of coaches that I think actually is what we're asking them to step into now is a huge, obviously challenge, but it's an opportunity in this context in that we could focus those conversations they're having with principals on how are Common Core and teacher effectiveness being integrated? How is your faculty coming to see these as parts of a whole? And I think they're critical. So we could think about roles. Math educators is another, where bringing together math teachers, folks who are responsible for math professional development in districts together to really grapple with the challenges of Common Core and to create that hopefully safe space where people can talk about the content knowledge demands because there's lots of current educators. I talked before about in teacher prep to focus on increasing that rigor and depth, but obviously we've got lots of teachers who could use that help now, and I think we have to think about where do we create that safe space, and just within their schools might not be the best way to think about that. Then there's also by area of focus, so we could think about, I know there's been a little bit of a strand over on the left-hand side around student learning objectives, and again, in my opinion, especially around integrating writing, integrating Common Core expectations, I think this focus on student learning objectives is a huge opportunity, but it's a new one, and everybody is having to build new expertise, experiment with new work at the same time. So creating networks of folks who are responsible for those performance assessments across districts, and really, again, setting up a process where you're also bringing in some expertise to look out for the integrity and to make sure we don't slide back on, well, this is what my students are able to do now, so here's a good test, but where we really keep that Common Core standard in mind and then try to look towards growth and what's a fair measure of progress, but being really clear and sticking with the rigor and the quality of the standard. And I also talked about potentially integrating academic writing throughout the curriculum. That could also be an area where you could bring people together who haven't normally worked with each other. And let me just, before I turn it back over, in this same vein, I was thinking about, I just want to reiterate a couple of points on the tools for teachers that I talked about. So one is that they, especially the academic writing, this most recent module that we released, but even the close reading modules as well, they really have a focus on the cross-curricular implications of the Common Core. And so those modules themselves potentially create a great space for bringing together teachers across the content areas. The last module on academic writing also talks about teaching the expectations in Common Core about teaching research through short and long-term research projects. And that, again, this seems like an area ripe for setting clear and consistent expectations across content areas and thinking about how these expectations can be reinforced across areas. So didn't want to miss the opportunity to mention that in this session. The other was that, and again, I just encourage people to look at it and you'll make your own assessment. We tried hard to live by those rules of engaging, educators in reading close text, engaging them in academically productive conversations, all of that in the activities we outlined in the PD modules. So again, those are free and available online, and would love to hear your feedback. If you do go check those out, if you decide to use them or you don't, we would love to hear how you use them, what you thought of them, what worked and what didn't for you. So just an offer in that regard. Now I'll turn it back to you, Elizabeth.
Great. So as we've heard and as you all know, there are a lot of resources out there. And so we've compiled several that we've mentioned in this presentation, and you'll find that in the web links and resources document down below. But here's just a few that we know have some good quality materials available to support this work around professional networks and PLCs. And so from Learning Forward, this is the organization that's established some standards for professional learning. ASCD, which does some work around curriculum and professional development for leaders, and the School Improvement Network, and all things PLC. You'll find the links, like I said, to all of those in the document. And again, I'm not going to go into detail into what's happening in New Jersey, but the establishment of PLCs across the state has provided state-level resources on topics related to Common Core, and then filtered this down to the local level. And I'm sure many of you from New Jersey are involved in this work. And the intent is to promote regular collaboration and to promote a collective vision for professional development at both the school and the district level, and to connect that to what's happening at the state level. In addition, in Massachusetts, the focus has also been on providing resources for PLCs to do the work that they need to do. And so at the district level, these resources are available to guide the work that PLCs are doing. So templates for collaboration, forms for how to collaborate and analyze assessments, and some other guiding materials about how to move from the standards to the essential learning outcomes. And so states are doing work to really support their local districts and their schools in getting this work done. But as we all know, there are a lot of resources, and finding the right ones and the ones that meet the needs of your context are really critical to doing the work well. So Ross, I think, has a few concluding comments, and then we're going to open it back up to the rest of you to hear a little bit more about your plans.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So just concluding, there are lots of challenges as schools and districts and states transition to the Common Core, including aligning teacher evaluation systems to the Common Core and aligning curriculum and professional development. I also tend to think about it as really a tremendous opportunity. I don't think it would be helpful if, frankly, to sequence, where we just changed and put in teacher effectiveness systems and then in a couple of years tried to change the content standards, or vice versa. I actually think that it's very helpful as we're trying to get really serious about what effective teaching looks like and create shared understanding and a more serious conversation about how we improve instruction in schools, making sure that we've got that that true vision in place about what students are going to need when they get out there in the world just seems like the right foundation. And so there's lots of moving pieces, and there's bound to be missteps and frustrations, but I actually think it's a pretty inspiring time to be trying to advance this work. And I hope that that you can see through to ways to bring this together for teachers. And so I'll just close with reiterating these recommendations, which is The first one is really enabling and encouraging prioritization of Common Core instructional shifts. So when we think about observations, not every time an evaluator goes into a classroom does it need to be a comprehensive observation that's looking at every cell in what needs to be a fairly complicated rubric to capture good teaching. But you might say, we're going to have one or two comprehensive observations this year, and we're going to have more that just focus on using questioning effectively and engaging students in academically productive discussions. And that's what I'm going to be focused on. That's what we're going to work on. So one is allowing for that focus. The second is making sure that we aren't sending mixed signals in the teaching frameworks. If they aren't prioritizing text-based questions, then that's a problem. And it's not that those are the only questions, but teachers ought to understand that's a central part of what quality instruction looks like moving forward. Insist that the assessments we use, and especially the assessments that we have the most control over, really reflect Common Core expectations, because those assessments are the ones that we can change in the near term. Fourth, take advantage of these early lessons and make sure that the professional development that we're offering folks actually models Common Core instruction, doesn't just exhort people to do something else, but to actually really be shoulder to shoulder with folks in enacting the Common Core, not just talking about somebody else doing it. And last, this does seem like a huge opportunity for networking. We're all doing the same things virtually at the same time, so figuring out how we harness technology, how we harness this this synergy between these initiatives to bring folks together for richer and deeper conversations about the work, again, just strikes me as a huge opportunity. So I thank you all. I'm very much looking forward to what comes up in the brainstorms and then what we can cover in question and answer. And I thank you all for the important work you do every day and for taking a little time to focus on this topic with me. So thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Like I mentioned, we really want to take the next 15 minutes or so to let you brainstorm and consider all that you've heard today, all that you do already know about Common Core and the implementation in your context, and consider what you can take away from the conversation. What action steps do you plan to take as a result of today's webinar? And we really hope this will be interactive in the sense that you will get a lot of great ideas from your fellow colleagues across the states. And we'll be responding, and Ross will be making some commentary on what he sees as the action steps you're planning to take. And I'll also take this opportunity to mention that I see a lot of people posting resources on the left side in the comment box, and that is great, and that's one of the ways that we've wanted these webinars to function, is for people to share their own resources. What we will do is collect those and post them on the Teacher Effectiveness Forum, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, but it's another resource to continue this conversation, and that way you all can go there to access the resources others have shared if you have not clicked on them yourself. So it looks like Carol's interested in reaching out to some local districts to start a conversation about a common evaluation framework that's being used. I think that's a great point and something that we're recognizing is a necessity, especially with some of our smaller rural districts throughout the country, that harnessing resources and capacity across districts is one way to get this work done and to guarantee that it's not going to be quite so overwhelming. A lot of small districts lack the capacity needed to take on these huge tasks, and so that is a great way to strengthen the conversation and to get the work done more efficiently. A lot of sharing with the curriculum teams and integrating some of what's been learned here with the professional development. I think that that is one of the key takeaways we've intended, is to ensure that people have a good understanding of this shift we also want to see in professional development and how professional learning needs to change in order for teachers to get the skills and the knowledge that they need to enact Common Core in their classrooms. I know one of the earlier comments was related to administrators, and we talked a little bit throughout the presentation about ensuring that administrators have the skills that they need to support this work. Ross, do you want to talk any about the work that you've seen happening at this level with school principals and maybe district level staff?
Sure. So one thing I'll mention is we actually just released, so we brought together Student Achievement Partners, which is where an organization, the Standards Writers, founded, and folks from a couple of other groups, Insight Education Group, that we looked at their framework that they built, and some of the others, Education First, actually worked on one of the rubrics as well. We brought those organizations together to actually create what we called a school-level transition guide, and it was really a resource for principals and instructional leadership teams to both self-assess and then think of some critical actions they could take to really build out the systems and the processes and the culture at the school level that it's going to take to meet Common Core expectations. So I'm happy to share that with you guys, potentially to post on the resources page, but also folks can go to the Aspen website, Aspen Institute and the education page, or to aspendrl.org. That stands for Digital Resource Library. So aspendrl.org, and it's there's a transition guide that's focused just on principals and instructional leadership teams. There's also actually a professional development module on how to purpose instructional leadership teams to advance Common Core. And I think it's a huge lever, and I think in some ways, I've seen states that have gone straight to teachers, and I think lots of the online work is targeted at giving teachers images, but there's a huge change management challenge in front of our principals that I think both of these bodies of work, teacher effectiveness and Common Core, are really putting a premium on that ability to articulate this vision and inspire and motivate people to make these changes. So it's a huge, it is absolutely right for folks to be focused on that. And I think in some ways there's been more work in central offices and more work focused on teachers than has really been focused on that critical role for principals. So I'd encourage folks to check out the professional development module and the transition guide that we have posted.
Great. Thanks for touching on that topic. I know it is critical that everyone's engaged in this and to really ensure that from all levels people are supporting the initiatives that are happening and we're all talking the same language. It's great to see the action steps that folks are planning to take, and it's exciting that people can walk away from a 2-hour webinar and really have some concrete steps to take, and we encourage you to collaborate with one another and ensure that this work gets done in your context. And at this time, I think we'll open it up for questions, so that if you do have any outstanding questions for Ross, this is your opportunity to ask those. at this time you can type in your questions in the content in the box that you see on the screen. So Ross, one question that we received is related to the non-tested grades and subjects, and how are those being addressed with respect to developing assessments and developing standards?
Yeah, so I guess so in my mind that takes two different forms. So one is for elementary teachers, in non-tested grades and subjects, I think that research is increasingly clear that the most important thing actually for reading comprehension as you progress to increasingly complex text is actually the background knowledge and the content knowledge and the academic vocabulary that you bring to that text. So absolutely we've got to focus on strong foundational skills for students in reading, and that's articulated in the Common Core in the early grades. But we also have to make sure that they have a rich curriculum. And I think one of the challenges, while we only have standards that are articulated in English language arts and math, we have to recognize that to genuinely deeply comprehend those subjects and apply them in the world as they're meant to be, students need to actually interact with content. They need to read content in other areas. They need to be talking about content. Those speaking, listening, writing standards need to play out in social studies and science. And science, itself actually can be a huge context for genuine application of math skills, of, using data, and that kind of quantitative literacy. So one is, again, I think this is where local educators have the most discretion in these quote-unquote additional measures of student learning, making sure that teachers understand how the Common Core has implications for instruction for those areas, and then thinking about the curriculum that you are implementing locally and making sure that you're drawing a line with your teachers from the curriculum through the Common Core standards to the assessments of those non-tested grades and subjects that really, for instance, has students in elementary school, maybe some of the teachers, effectiveness determination, some of that student learning data could come from the kinds of projects that students are going to do in social studies and science. And those could draw on the Common Core skills and expectations. I think it's then different when you get into the secondary grades where teachers have more discrete subjects they're teaching. That's where we really need to be very deliberate about the assessment of student learning in biology, in the CTE subjects. It's got to reflect the articulated literacy standards for social studies, science, and technical subjects, or we're just not going to get there. So I guess that's how I would answer in non-tested grades and subjects. And let me just point out that Appendix C, so there are 3 appendices to the literacy standards, and Appendix C has writing samples across the curriculum. So in these other subjects, there are writing samples that meet the literacy expectations in science, in technical subjects. So folks can look to there and, in a sense, use those exemplars to back map what kind of instruction would it take to get there and what kind of assessments could we put in place in our system that would point in that direction.
And Ross, as kind of a piggyback to that question, someone's also asking about these, what we've considered special content areas in elementary school, music, art, PE, and how do we want to look at those content areas in terms of this non-tested grades and subjects conversation when they're maybe not necessarily viewed as
So let me say, I mean, I actually think they are worth assessing. I think the challenge actually is in developing assessments that are genuine to those disciplines so that we're not asking teachers to fit their instruction into an assessment box, but that we're actually fitting assessment into what we want actually those teachers and students doing. I think for me, this really goes back to needing to have a more comprehensive look at the curriculum. And I worry very much. Believe me, I am a strong supporter of high expectations in literacy and mathematics. But again, as I tried to articulate before, students need to interact with that content in lots of different ways. And so, you know, thinking about, like, I know I'm familiar with something called the core knowledge sequence that really, and that's an open source curriculum at this point. The Core Knowledge Foundation has made that publicly accessible. And it is, one of the things it does is it helps teachers see how in art you can reinforce what students are learning in social studies about different eras of human history. And you can reinforce what they're learning in English language arts. And so it's figuring out what's an authentic way of bringing those specials, as it were, into the fold and thinking about this comprehensive approach to what students need. The other thing I'd say is, you know, the Common Core articulates very specific standards for students' speaking and listening abilities. I think this is a great advance in terms of not just having discrete reading standards or even just discrete reading and writing standards, but recognizing the sort of reinforcing nature of reading, speaking, listening, and writing. Actually, they all grow together. And so figuring out, you know, we struggle with valid and reliable assessments in speaking and listening, and it may very well be that that's something that we want, where we want to ask the specials teachers to help us innovate. And I guess so those are a couple of ways of responding to that.
Great. I think we have one more question that I think we have time for, and then we'll be getting ready to wrap up. But this last one is related to something you already briefly touched on, but someone's interested in having you elaborate on the notion of having the professional development emulate the Common Core reading and writing expectations and your suggestion for doing that.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to think of what I can say that's meaningful that doesn't just repeat. I mean, I think that I worry that I think in lots of ways we need to model the kind of behavior that we want to see in schools and classrooms at the system level. And so one of the ways, and I spent a lot of time focused more actually discretely on the teacher evaluation work, and one of the things that I've encouraged there is using surveys of teachers' experiences of the evaluation and the observations and the feedback, both to have a better read on how the evaluation system is playing out, and because I think it creates a context where we would be asking school leaders and their supervisors to be in that, to model what it means to be open to feedback and to change based on that feedback. And I think that it's just incredibly important that we think about, so how do we not ask people to do work, but how do we actually, again, get shoulder to shoulder with them and help them to do the work? And so it really, I think there are some pretty clear signals that come out of the Common Core itself about what instruction ought to look like. And I think as we think about engaging adults in that kind of learning experience, they should have an experience where they have experienced the Common Core, not they have heard about the Common Core, not that somebody told them about the Common Core, but where they have actually applied its expectations in their work. So making sure that we're not dumbing it down, but actually using complex text. That could be the standards themselves. It could also be, one other resource to mention. We put out a primer a little over a year ago, a primer on close reading of text, because I think it's this term that sort of sprang up in the conversation around Common Core implementation, and it quickly became a very politicized term, with some people saying we needed to have this very pure implementation of close reading, no scaffolding, no pre-reading activities, and other folks saying this isn't fair, we've got to meet students where they are, students need to be motivated to read. And I think what we tried to do with this primer was just, but there was an assumption in all those political conversations that everybody knew what close reading of text was, and that there was all of this shared understanding about where it fit into a curriculum and into a set of instructional strategies. So I think we tried to unpack that for people. And so one of the things I think we need to do in modeling Common Core is not dumb it down, but actually engage people in looking at the research themselves and understanding why we're doing this, and then giving them a chance to work through these activities themselves, to be in conversations, not where they're asking questions of the presenter, but where they are talking with colleagues about the work, and where they are invited to and expected to critique and offer critical feedback to others, because that's something we're asking them to do. We're asking them to ask their students to do in their classrooms. And lastly, I think just one of the keys to the Common Core writ large is to be relevant, to actually help people see the connection between academic learning and getting things done in their lives that they want to do, that they aspire to do. So for our students, that's about being ready for colleges and careers. And I think we should be doing the same with our teachers, where we're saying, what you want to do is improve your instruction, so let's be very focused on how you are going to apply this in your classrooms, to the point of making time in professional development for teachers both to practice and to plan for Common Core instruction and to get feedback on that.
We've now come to the end of our webinar, but the conversation isn't over. In fact, it may be just beginning. Please complete the evaluation form following today's webinar. Your feedback will help us improve future webinars. I'd like to invite you to use the REL Mid-Atlantic website as a hub for continuing the conversation. There are some great resources listed there as well, including links to material from the What Works Clearinghouse. And for webinar participants in the REL Mid-Atlantic region, you'll also find links to state coordinators. You can contact them for assistance or more information about the REL. Thanks again for joining us today.